Hello everyone, welcome to the second day of the 2025 Castle Lectures. It's wonderful to see the room full 2 days in a row, but of course this does not surprise me given the caliber of our speaker, Dr. Raghuram Rajan, who of course, as you know, comes to us from the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. As I mentioned yesterday, the objective of this lecture series, which was generously funded by Mr. John Castle, is to foster a robust dialogue about the moral foundations of society and government. And Dr. Raghuram Rajan's examination of the private corporation's role in society perfectly matches this mission. And I want to take this opportunity to thank him for taking time from his busy schedule to spend 2 full days with us and deliver these very engaging lectures. Thank you so much and welcome again. All right, so in terms of logistics, we're going to follow the same format as yesterday. So Dr. Rajan is going to speak for about 45-50 minutes, and then we're going to have plenty of time for Q&A. I encourage all of our students to also ask your questions at that time. If you have clarifying questions throughout the way, please ask them, and Dr. Rajan will keep the right to push your question to the Q&A if he thinks it's not really a clarifying question. All right, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Anna. Thanks again for inviting me to give these lectures. There are some people here who weren't here yesterday. Probably they're the innocent, the ones who saw yesterday. Some of them. Let me talk about what I'm going to talk about today, and then bring you up to speed a little on what we talked about yesterday for those who weren't here. I know some people from Mike's class. By the way, Mike here, this handsome young man here was actually the first person I met at MIT when I came to MIT in 1987, so long back, and I thought he was a professor, and he was actually an undergrad. We figured out the confusion after some time, but it was great working with Mike then, and I'm glad to see him and members of his class again. He's a great guy. I'm sure you already know that, and it's wonderful to be here with him. Okay, where I left off yesterday was really, I talked about some theories of the firm and talked about why those theories may lead to certain objectives. So today, where I'm going to pick up is what those objectives we see emerging are, how the political environment seems to be affecting those objectives, and then, what ought to be the objectives. Have we gone too far in one direction or the other? That's where I'm going to go. And then I'm going to show you some data. Now, this is really data looked at from 30,000 feet. It's correlations. It's not causality. But I'm going to try and say, okay, if we explore this data further, what might we find? So I'm going to show you data from a preliminary investigation. This is not finished yet. We're just in the midst of it. We've spent 4 years on this, just collecting the data and then running the initial sort of, plots. And I want to tell you in a little bit, I see some young students here, about the process of research also, how just looking at the data, looking at the plots, you can maybe sharpen your analysis. Let the theory also be driven a little by the data that you see, okay? All this stuff is preliminary. So what the Castle lectures forced me to do was actually think about this carefully. And of course, I thought about it, but I didn't have anybody challenge me on the thinking. And that's what I hope in the Q&A. We already had some discussion both yesterday and last night over dinner. But the whole point about academic thinking is you want to be challenged. And then, you try and sharpen the fuzzy logic that you had. So I know some of this logic is fuzzy, but I hope your questions will enable me to sharpen it. Okay, so that's where we're going. First, a little more thought formulation or theory. I wouldn't say it's theory, but it's more thinking about this thing carefully, and then I want to show you some data. What we did yesterday was we started with economics. What were the rationales for why firms exist? And how do we sort of extrapolate from that to what the objectives of the firm should be, both from an internal efficiency perspective and then setting the firm within the economy from a broader economy-wide perspective. And I'll tell you a little how the two link in just a second. But from the efficiency perspective, when you think about small owner-managed firms, there's a lot of reason we talked about yesterday why, having the manager own makes sense, and therefore why shareholder value maximization follows naturally. By maximizing the value of the residual claim, you're maximizing the value of the whole, given assumptions about what everybody else contributes, basically assuming everybody, just to fix thoughts, you can be more general than that. Supposing you pay everybody a fixed amount, all the workers are paid a fixed wage, then maximizing what's left over is like maximizing the whole because everybody else is fixed. You can extrapolate that, but basically small firms, shareholder value maximization makes sense. We have elevated that to be a principle even for large firms, that large firms should be managed in the interest of shareholders. And I spent some time arguing yesterday that doesn't follow. It's not necessarily true. And part of the reason it's not true is in many large firms, in more complicated firms, whether it's NVIDIA or GM, there are a lot more investors in the firm. And what happens within the firm are you have a whole lot of power structures that build up because of the specific investments people have made, and that becomes a source of rents to those people. And once you have alternate, they're not getting a fixed wage. Once they are getting revenues in proportion to what they've invested, you basically have multiple centers of power within the firm. And in that kind of firm, you want to rethink the idea that shareholders are the residual claimant. They're not, because there are other implicit equity claimants, what sometimes in the parlance is called sweat equity. These are people who gain claims, even if not explicit, by virtue of having specialized for the firm. It could be suppliers in one situation. It could be highly skilled employees in another situation. It could be really important customers in a different situation. So what I call these are, key contractual stakeholders who are part of the whole production enterprise of the firm. And because they've made specific investments and because those investments are valuable, it makes sense to have a governance structure for the firm which protects those investments. And sometimes the best way to protect those investments is to have a kind of third-party board, which essentially you vest the ownership rights in that third-party board. It's not part of the hurly-burly, the mess of what goes on within the firm, but it's supposed to take decisions impartially given the various stakeholders who are playing a part in the production process, right? So if you have this, then essentially you don't have to give ownership to any particular set of stakeholders. Stakeholders can really gain power by making the kinds of specific investments they need to make. In fact, it's efficient not to give them ownership claims which give them independent sources of power. Instead, force their power to be endogenous, to be created by the kind of specific investments they make. And in this kind of world, third-party ownership makes a lot of sense. In most other worlds, third-party ownership doesn't make so much sense, okay? So that's part of what we talked about yesterday. And then we spent a little time on the dynamics saying, okay, this is about how a firm can be managed efficiently, a large firm. But once you're talking about large firms, you have to think about also market power. Large firms are big in their sector, big in their industry, maybe even big enough to have political power. If you think of the Ambanis and the Adanis in India, or you think of the Chaebols in South Korea, they have political power because of their size. And then the question is, how do you play that? What is the limit of that? And the worry there is, how do you maintain competition in the economy when big firms become large enough to dominate sectors or dominate the economy? And today, in this country, we have the same issue with Elon Musk traveling around the White House, right? So these are important questions that we need to address. And then I went to, okay, given all this, let's talk about what's been happening on the specifics on thinking on firms. I started with Milton Friedman. Actually, I started with Adam Smith, Burley, and Dodd, and then went on to Milton Friedman. And basically said Milton Friedman follows earlier thinkers like Adolph Burley in saying shareholders are the residual claimants. They are the owners of the firm. And anything that reduces their interests is terrible. It's a form of agency, okay? Now, I also argued that there's no rationale for that view. It doesn't follow from a kind of optimization in the firm. It really follows from tiny firms, laundromats, and moving companies, not really the large firm like GM or NVIDIA. And there it's a much more complicated issue. But I put the point about Milton Friedman to say that some of this thinking comes in the environment, which the political environment of those times. I said, part of Milton Friedman's point that firms were about maximizing shareholder value was resisting the push at those times for much more social responsibility for firms. And we'll see that right around the time Milton Friedman made a statement, firms start departing from saying they have any social responsibility. We'll see that in the data. I'll come back to that a little later. But you must see this as part of the political debate. The other problem with Milton Friedman, apart from how do you incentivize management to work for shareholder interests, especially if shareholders are dispersed. And some people have argued the way you do that is by giving management tremendous stock ownership, unsightly amounts of, godly amounts of stock. But I think the bigger problem with Friedman is on the political side, which is it's very hard to defend externally when you say we're all about profits. You remember Gordon Gekko, if you saw the movie, was it Wall Street? Greed, for want of another term, is good, or in short, greed is good. It's very hard to defend greed is good publicly. It doesn't sell well. But it's as much it doesn't sell well outside as it doesn't sell well internally. If you are an employee of a firm which says greed is good, how do you feel about working in such a firm if you're a young, idealistic student? Not very good, right? You want to save the world. You don't save the world by saying greed is good. So it's not internally sustainable also. The political difficulty came to the fore with the global financial crisis, right? Where these profit-maximizing banks seem to have taken us down a dark road, losing enormous amounts of money for the economy and having to be bailed out. So post-global financial crisis, much less of a willingness to see profit maximization as the sole goal of companies. And so we move to a new environment where, just as in Milton Friedman's time, there's a lot more pressure on corporations to do more than focus on the bottom line. Colin Mayer has been a leader in this. He's from Oxford, and he talks about companies having a purpose. And purpose as he says, is about producing profitable solutions and not profiting from producing problems. Okay, so that's version of it. Makes wonderful poetry. It is alliterative. It's great. And who doesn't want to feel good about what they're doing, right? We're creating solutions for the problems of people and the planet, and we're not creating problems. A sort of version of this has been pushed by Larry Fink. Larry Fink, those of you who know, is the chairman of BlackRock. And that's one of the biggest stock owners in the country. Larry Fink basically manages the stock portfolios for many, many millions of Americans. And he started in 2017 writing a letter to all the companies. And as a major stockholder, of course, as a proxy for people who ultimately own the stock, but still filtering their thoughts and passing them on to companies, he started writing a letter where he said, society demands that companies serve a social purpose, right? And basically, he argued without a sense of purpose, a company will ultimately lose its license to operate. You can see how this plays well in the post-financial crisis context where companies, especially the financial sector, has lost its legitimacy. He's of the financial sector. In fact, he was a big part of the rescue. A lot of the rescue done by the Treasury was with the help of BlackRock. And so he's basically saying, we need to be more than about profits. We need to have a bigger theme. Otherwise, we lose our legitimacy. And after all, property rights are a social construct. It's not written in law that this kind of property will be respected. The law is a result of social consensus. And so, private firms are, one form of property, and you're trying to change the consensus around them by saying they should do more, okay? And so the purposive or progressive view starts making a lot of headway in public. And this really wants managers to work in the broader interest. Now, I've argued that you can get the theory to say you should go beyond shareholders and work for key stakeholders who matter to the production process. But what the purposive view wants to do is go even further than that. We want to work for all stakeholders, not just, key employees or customers, but the community and the society we live in. We have to pay attention to all that, right? So we want to go beyond. In other words, it's fairly straightforward to say a company should, do well by doing good. So do good to the extent that you do well by it. That makes sense. It's part of the broader company value maximizing strategy. But this purposive view goes further and says you should just do good, even if it has no connection to the company itself. If you can do good, do more good. Now that seems unexceptionable, but I will say I find it a little problematic, and I'll tell you why in just a bit. I will come back to that, but keep that in mind. The purposive view goes beyond doing well by doing good to just doing good. And should companies actually do just good? What I would feel more comfortable with is a middle ground. And that middle ground is, nod to Burley and Friedman and say, yes, there is certainly, for all that Larry Fink says, there's certainly a lot of value in just producing a desirable product or service at an attractive price while obeying the laws of the land. If that's all a company does, it has merited its license to exist. It doesn't have to save the world. It doesn't have to feed starving children in sub-Saharan Africa to justify its purpose. It just makes good soap at a decent price, that's enough. That's sort of paying a little bit of homage to Burley and Friedman. But where I depart from them is saying it's not just about shareholder value, it's about the broader doing well by doing good, which means doing good within the realm of what you can actually achieve, which is, employees who work for the firm, who are critical to the value of the firm. You can do well by being nice to them, by respecting the kinds of investments they make and protecting those investments, okay? Similarly, customers and so on. But again, there's a limit to doing that. Don't go beyond that. In this kind of world, profits or share prices are only a partial and incomplete indicator. The board is a mediating hierarchy. We've talked about that. And the board essentially is not about shareholder value maximization, but about the firm's value addition to society. How can we add value, broadly speaking, as a production process, knowing that we're essentially aligned with the business of the firm? That alignment is important. You can't stray too much away from that, and I'll come back to why in a second. Certainly, this kind of view of the firm is consistent with how the law is interpreted by the courts. According to Delaware's corporate code, Delaware is perhaps the most sort of the place where most corporations incorporate, and basically say corporations can be formed to conduct or promote any lawful business or purposes. Says very little about their needing to maximize shareholder value. It's about what business they do, and a lot of what the boards decide is usually interpreted as boards are fiduciaries for the firm. They're supposed to protect the firm, not necessarily shareholders. Okay, there are some circumstances in which it's narrowly viewed from the shareholder perspective. The Revlon case is often cited, but more generally, courts tend to say you should be about protecting the value of the firm. And that's completely consistent with what we're talking. That is, Stout, and that's Blair there. And these are two people who helped talk about this, and they're talk about it given the kind of theory that Luigi and I wrote. In this kind of world, should boards specify relevant stakeholders? I think there is value to doing that, because typically stakeholders find it difficult to understand what kinds of choices firms will make when they have to make trade-offs. And by specifying we will be more customer-friendly or we will be more employee-friendly, we have a culture of respecting employees, they're signaling that when push comes to shove, who will they pay attention to? And this is often strengthened by the kinds of stories that firms will tell, what we did in these difficult situations. Let me give you two examples. Customer is king, right? What does that mean? Well, in 2000, I'm trying to remember, was it 2008, 2009? Some terrorists attacked the Taj Hotel in Bombay. And there's a massive slaughter of people within those hotels, all customers. The Taj employees, chefs in restaurants, waiters, they basically took it upon themselves to essentially manage the situation and protect the customers as best as they could. So herded the customers into safe places, were on lookout, spent their time trying to actually ensure all the customers were safe. There was one manager who actually, his wife and daughter were killed, even while he was trying to look after the customers that were under his watch. And that's a true definition of customer as king, right? We've all heard about captains not leaving the sinking ship until everybody else is on board. There wasn't that tradition in hotels. It wasn't that you're the last person to be in the hotel. You switch off the lights when everybody's left. But that's exactly what they did, even while the terrorists were roaming with guns around. That's comes from a culture where you actually din it into the employees. The customer is important. The customer is king. You don't put your life on the line for profits. You put it on the line for culture, for an ethos, for a tradition. Another example from this country is when you put employees in front or ahead of shareholders. Google, you remember, started off way back saying, do no evil. That was their motto. Of course, we make fun of it today, but at some point, there was a fair amount of thinking behind that. It attracted a kind of employee who believed that this was the right thing to do, often left of center young people. And there was a situation at one point where Google was asked by the Department of Defense to develop artificial intelligence to help drones target people. And this was called Project Maven. And Google signed on the dotted line, took up the project, and then the employees said, no, we don't want the company actually doing this kind of stuff. We don't want to enter this kind of killing field. And Google backed down. It essentially withdrew from Project Maven. Other companies, of course, replaced it, but basically saying this is not consistent with what we do as a company. Choosing people over shareholders because the kind of employee they attracted, they wanted to send the message that we're for you. I think this kind of signal, this kind of tradition, this kind of narrative, which comes through folklore within the firm, helps strengthen the particular kind of stakeholder. Of course, the environment can change, the times can change, the company can change, but at that point, this was a way of strengthening the particular stakeholder they cared about. It also enables internal governance. When the company departs from that narrative, then there's a lot of angry young people who came in because they were brought in on the basis that that narrative was important, and they feel betrayed. And that's when, there's a cost of moving away from that narrative. So in a sense, once you send the narrative, the right kind of constituencies also come around that narrative, making it costlier to depart. Now, in this kind of world, I would argue that, yes, all this is important, but you have to be careful not to go beyond your skis. And that's where I say there's a limit to the extent that you want to take up social goals. And I'll come back to that in a second. So here's where we are. We talked a little bit about this, and this. We talked about two extremes, Milton Friedman and the progressive, purposive view. And I want to be somewhere in the middle. Middle is never a good place to be in politically. It doesn't sell well. It's always easier to sell the extremes. But I'd rather that we try and, go for what's sensible rather than what sells. Then I want to come to placing the corporation in society, because I ended this by saying, look, I think these narratives in favor of particular stakeholders you care about is important, but you shouldn't be too broad-based. You shouldn't keep saying we're going to save the world. It attracts a lot of people to say you're going to save the world, but I think that's a step too far. And I'm going to come to that in a second, but first I want to talk about the dynamics. I'll talk about that in a little. I'll talk about it in this context also. Remember, the dynamics were, how do you prevent corporations, now that they're efficient, now that they're large, from essentially dominating industry and in some cases dominating government and the politics? And, ironically, you need an independent sort of agency to contain large corporations. And that agency is government. Government can be a check on anti-competitive behavior, antitrust, and so on. And that preserves competition, preserves innovation, etc. Okay? In recent years, for example, Lina Khan's antitrust department has gone after big tech with the idea they're killing competition, they're buying up any potential rival, and then basically ensuring they don't become rivals. And they have the ability to do that for a variety of reasons. We can get into that. But that's where government sort of comes in as a limit on corporate sort of expansion. But of course, government can also be part of the problem. One, when it becomes overly bureaucratic and limits innovation, while arguably Europe is in that position, they're already ready to regulate AI, but they have no big AI company, unlike the United States. They have the regulations in place, they don't have the companies. Or you have governments in a variety of emerging markets, but even now in the United States, which could potentially participate in suppressing competition because of the cronyism. We work with a few large companies and we give them excessive support, limiting the ability of others to challenge them. And again, you can see examples of cronyism in country after country. So how do you fight this? I don't have incredibly novel answers. But the one thing I would start with is keep clear the separation between government and companies. The more you allow companies to sort of engage on the turf of the government, forming regulations, substituting for the government, the harder it is to keep government and the companies separate. And therefore, I would say that separation is very important. I'll come back to that in a second. Another way you could keep the government honest is if there are multiple players vying for power amongst the companies. So this was Madison's point about competitive parties keeping democracy alive and policy reasonable. I would say the same thing with companies. Having many companies sort of fight for their version of policy keeps the policymaker relatively honest. If you have a dominant company, then their view tends to prevail. And that again speaks to the Brandeistic, Justice Brandeis suggested limits to corporate size of power. And if you look at the history of the United States, as Mark Rowe described very well in a book in 1994, the US has constantly cut really big companies down to size, with the idea of maintaining not just economic competition, but political competition. When Standard Oil got too big, it was cut down to size and forced to break up. When the banks got too big, you imposed Glass-Steagall, which broke up the banks and separated them into commercial and investment banks. When Microsoft got too big, you hit it with a lawsuit. It didn't break up, but the lawsuit ensured that there were limits on Microsoft's scale. And of course, big tech has been attracting that kind of attention, not just from the Biden administration, but apparently, and we will see from the Trump administration also, that maybe these guys are a little too big and a little too powerful. So you can limit corporations. Another way to limit capture is to not have one single point of capture, not have a totally centralized administration, but decentralize. And therefore, when you have multiple points of capture, the same guy may not be able to capture all those points. One example of this is China, which had, a whole bunch of regional governments having their regional champions. But because each government competed with the other governments, it was competitive cronyism. There was cronyism within the government, but competition between the cronies, which kept competition, in a sense, alive. And finally, this is a point that Luigi and I make in a book, Saving Capitalism from the Capitalists, is competition between countries. Unfortunately, we're seeing much more protectionism, which prevents this. But one way to keep regulation reasonable within a country is to have competition between countries. You can't become too inefficient because in that case, things, in that case, your local champion essentially falters. And so trade and investment and openness helps preserve the competition, which also helps preserve internal competition within countries. Lastly, let me come to the gaps left by government, and then I'll come to the empirics. So one of the things I've kept saying is that, we want to make sure that corporations don't substitute too much for government, to intervene on the turf of government. This is against the recent ethos, which is really, governments are not playing their role. They're not fighting climate change. So corporations should fill the gap. There are lots of preferred social outcomes. For example, policies on, to pick an example, transgender bathrooms, big issue. Why don't corporations step up and speak up about it? Because they should advocate for preferred social outcomes. Or, January 6th happened. Why didn't the corporations step up and say, this is terrible, this is an attack on democracy, and this shouldn't happen? So there's a lot of push for corporations to step up and to substitute, sometimes when there's no voice, sometimes to add their voice because they're a powerful entity, and sometimes because the system is changing. I would argue that I'm all for emergency responses. If there's an earthquake and you have the only earth movers in town, by all means, let them go out and help people. But as a systemic response, I think corporations have to be careful to go too much into the social sphere where they're doing good, but not because it's aligned with the business that they have. And I would also argue that, if democracy is being threatened, if the system of capitalism is being threatened, there is value for corporations to add their weight against it. But first, it's hard to know when it's a threat and it's simply politics as usual. And second, I think it does have an enormous effect on business. So you have to do it when you do think that this is actually going to make a difference in the nature of the framework of society. So what are the dangers I'm talking about? And then I'll go to spend 15 minutes on the data. Dangers are really when there's no alignment between doing good and doing well. In other words, it's related to your business. If it's completely unaligned, it's just doing good for the sake of doing good, there's no sense of how much is too little or too much. There's also no attachment to the framework of what the firm is about. And if there's no attachment to the framework of what the firm is about, it's very hard to predict what the firm will do or whether this will be durable, right? On prediction, for example, who decides your political position on this or that issue if it's unrelated to the business? Will it change with the board or with the whims of the next CEO? Is there going to be any kind of direction in the firm? And how should the firm decide on these things? Okay? Is it going to be the will of the CEO? Is it going to be the will of the employees? Is it going to be the will of the customers? It becomes a whole different ball game when it's unconnected to the business of the firm. I can understand if my customers are all, I'm selling guns and the customers are all right-wing buyers. I can understand why it might make sense from a customer perspective to not be, very much on the other side. But once there's no connection, then it's very hard to understand how firms pick positions. Better not to have a position, again, unless the system itself is threatened. But I would argue also that, part of the problem is durability, and that's a huge issue. If you're helping a poor neighborhood and you picked it out of the blue and you went in, what commitment do you have to continue services in that neighborhood? It's purely voluntary. You're doing it. You're spending your money. But you can pull services anytime you want. And is that a good thing? I would say it might do more damage than good if you go in and spend some money and then withdraw on the drop of a hat because your CEO changed or something. And I think the chances of withdrawing are much larger when it is connected to a specific whim. There's a company which did this. Unilever, under Paul Polman. In 2009, he was brought in, make changes. He said the change is going to be sustainability. We're going to focus on sustainability throughout, hang the shareholder. It made sense initially because what is sustainability? It's cost cutting, it's being more frugal, it's helping your farmers do better things. All that is good. It actually even elevated the share price for some time. But they made a lot of commitments because he went beyond what was important for the firm, but he wanted to think about the world. Paul Polman was at every Davos forum talking about sustainability, how corporations had a purpose, responsibility, all the stuff that Larry Fink talked about. What happened? Unilever lost its way. It became an NGO talking about making changes for climate rather than a soap-making company. And once it lost its way, it basically couldn't continue. A corporation is different from an NGO. They essentially, there was a hostile bid for Unilever from 3 Brazilian billionaires and Warren Buffett. They managed to survive that bill, but Paul Polman soon left and Unilever flipped back. And recently, its CEO was fired for not elevating the stock price over the last 2 years. There's no commitment. No commitment because they went far beyond their skis to trying to save the planet and lost track of the fact that their fundamental purpose was making soap or whatever else Unilever makes. You can't be so misaligned, but the problem for society is durability. I mean, I love Unilever doing this stuff, but how do I know they're in for the long run? And moreover, if they're in, how do I know that they're not changing the rules of the game to benefit them? Corporations don't have credibility in this. They're not NGOs. There's a bottom line they have to manage also. And so if they're talking about sustainability and they're forming rules for sustainability, why is it not rules to hamper their competition? Once you reduce the space between companies and the government, there is always greater scope for cronyism. And so I'd rather keep them separate. You want to do good? Do it through a private NGO or something like that. You want to do good because it's good for your business? Great, wonderful. But you need to find the alignment. You can't just go completely off track. We can debate this. I'm sure this is not. This will not be universally accepted in this room. Happy to take questions on it, but I think it's important. Okay, let me finally take. I want to have more discussions, so take 8-10 minutes on the empirics. What we do is we look at letters from CEOs to shareholders in the United States, starting with letters in 1955. So we've got, do the math, about 70 years worth of letters, near about that. And we follow letters written by Fortune, we as Pietro Ramella, Sansing, and Luigi Zingales. This is a 1/4 paper where I'm first author. That's because all the other names are it matters actually in academia. It turns out first authors are more cited or more recognized than last authors. It's only with Luigi that I beat him in terms of being ahead of him. Okay, so 150 American companies from 55 to 2020, that's the Fortune sample, and S&P 500 companies from 1980 to 2020. So actually this should be updated to 2023. We've taken it up to 2023. This is a kind of letter preamble, Amazon talking to its shareholders. What is really interesting is Amazon, which is often accused of, capturing market share and pushing out. That was Lina Khan's thesis or big opus that Amazon was killing the competition. Amazon actually says the stronger our market leadership, the more powerful our economic model. So they see it as a virtue that they actually own the market, and market leadership can translate to higher revenue, higher profitability. So they're talking to their shareholders in a very frank way, which is amazing to me. This is stuff that can play a part in lawsuits, and the fact that they're so open is interesting. But there are letters like this. Let me go quickly to what we see in the letters. We first, in terms of sentence distribution, we divided the sentences into different topics. The one topic that's left out is other. There is another which we couldn't classify or was too numerous. If you look at the performance topics, the sentences that relate to corporate performance, they were about 60% of the letter earlier. By about 2025, it's come down to about 40%. So it's not so much routine descriptions of performance. There's a lot more talk about stakeholders. Today, that's last bit is a little bigger than this. There is on the external environment, government policy, etc. They used to talk a lot about government policy. And over time, they talk less about government policy. What they talk more about is the pink bar, which is their values, their objectives. They're much more open about that. I'll show more about it in just a second. Talk very little initially, talk much more. And of course, social responsibility, the talk has also increased. But let me show you in greater detail. These are the sentences on financial performance in the dashed line. It combines talk about earnings and financial performance and talk about dividends and shareholder value. And you can see there used to be a lot of talk about it. It has come down substantially. Just in comparison, look at talk about operating performance. How you're doing on the operations, that has been pretty steady as a share of sentences. So they talk less about finance than they used to.
Has been a change in the length of the statements?
I had that. I removed that letter, that chart. It is actually, on both ends, it's exactly the same. Around 50 sentences. It goes up, comes down, and is exactly the same. Both, interestingly, for the S&P, which starts in 1980 and ends in 2023, and Fortune, which is 55 and 2023. The same pattern. So it seems like, there are periods when they talk a little less, they write a little less, but both endpoints are exactly at the same point. I'll send you that chart, actually. So we define a goal and value as a set of principles that guide corporate behavior, corporate commitments, and its priorities. By the way, all this is run through ChatGPT in order to get this stuff. I can tell you the details. I don't have a huge amount of time. The way this worked is we asked it to describe the values in 2,000 letters and then clustered them, put them into 15 buckets as 15 values, and then let ChatGPT rate all the letters in these categories. In these 15 values, ask them to have 3 categories. The value is not mentioned. There's weak emphasis on the value, and there's strong emphasis on the value, okay? And these are the values that we found: maximizing shareholder value, improving financial performance, et cetera, enhancing growth and globalization. So 6 aspects of performance. 3 relating to stakeholders. One is broadly talking about stakeholders, customers, employees. Then social, again, broadly corporate social responsibility, diversity and inclusion, environmental sustainability. And the last is another category. We couldn't quite place them in any of these, so they're there. It turns out that about 60% of the firms used to express at least one goal. But there were 40% that had one goal or zero goals. 20% zero, 20% one. Both those have come down to zero. Most firms now have multiple goals that they express in their letters. It turns out the average number of goals has climbed, right? This is conditional on having a goal, you had about 2 goals. Now, conditional on having a goal, you have about 7 goals. Companies are for everything. Here's international paper we found was an egregious example of having many goals. We continue to lead the world in responsible forest stewardship to ensure healthy and productive forest ecosystems. Employees, emissions, recyclable, long-term value for stakeholders, cost of capital returns for shareholders. We're about everybody and everything. It turns out that this is very similar to the Business Roundtable statement, which was made in 2019. We care about all our stakeholders and we want to be nice to all of them. It's a completely vacuous statement. You can't be nice to everybody. You have to choose. And this kind of statement seems more a political statement trying to, be nice to everybody. But what we see over time in terms of goals is in the 1950s, financial goals, shareholder value or financial performance was relatively small. A number of companies saying that was a top goal was relatively small. The biggest goal that was announced was typically growth. Companies were about growth. That still is one of the most important goals, but everything else has also grown along with. What were the goals in the 1950s? It was growth and efficiency. It was product innovation, innovation and product design, and it was a strategic focus of the company, but it wasn't finance. Okay? Over time, it turned out finance grew. And this is where I show you what happens with the financial goals. This is broadly improved financial performance, but not talking specifically about shareholders. This is the line which is really interesting. Before Friedman, nobody talked about shareholder value. What happened after Friedman is they all started talking about shareholder value to a greater extent, about 40% of the firms. Every recession, corporations stopped talking about shareholder value. That doesn't make sense when you just had a big loss and your share price plummeted. I think presumably this year, nobody's going to talk about shareholder value. It went down. Then they start talking about shareholder value again. It sort of peaks around the mid-1990s. And since then, it's been coming down. Okay, so shareholder value most recently this is the global financial crisis, and it plummets after the global financial crisis. Consistent with what I said, companies feel embarrassed talking about profits and privatizing sort of the revenues, when in fact you've just created a massive crisis. Let me just... on the other hand, this is growth. Growth is flat throughout. The number of companies saying growth is an objective is pretty high and standard throughout. This is another picture of the shareholder value. This is just to show, this is exactly the same picture I showed you earlier, how many companies say shareholder value. But if we say, just to check on ChatGPT, just look for the word shareholder value in the, stockholder value, etc., in the letter, and just report that, it shows the same shape. So essentially, we are picking up something that seems reasonable, even though we're asking ChatGPT to make a judgment. What about, let's take 3 buckets of objectives. One is corporate performance objectives. Remember those 6 objectives I talked about? Those are, is the company doing better business-wise? Then there are the stakeholder objectives. Are the employees, are you talking about doing better for your employees, doing better for your customers, doing better for your stakeholders? And then there is the social objective. Are you doing better for the environment? Are you doing better for society in general? Do you have corporate social responsibility? Are you doing better for diversity and inclusion? And what we see is an interesting pattern. Yes, the focus on performance has increased, falling off a little bit recently before the pandemic and picking up again after the pandemic. For stakeholders, it essentially climbed steadily from 1980. Remember, 1980 is when shareholders also, after that initial burst, took off again. It seems like corporations are trying to balance shareholders and stakeholders. They want to talk about both in the same breath, and I'll show you a little more evidence of that. But this also goes up steadily. What moves in long cycles, however, is social. What you see is in the early 60s, social responsibility climbs. 1970s, Milton Friedman. Social responsibility falls tremendously. Whether he echoed a mood or whether people listened to him and came down, unclear. And then it climbs again. You can explain some of these bumps. Often social responsibility about the environment increases when there's a disaster. Exxon Valdez, for example, in 1989, that tends to increase energy companies saying they're all about the social. In fact, every time a company is fined by the EPA, it suddenly becomes for social responsibility. But that's cynical. But what I'm saying is that suggests social responsibility has a political element to it. What I want you to pay attention to is this. Huge increase in the 2010s after the global financial crisis. We're trying to get legitimacy, what Larry Fink is talking about, purpose. We want to get the public to believe in us. Huge increase in whereabouts social responsibility. This also includes George Floyd and the increase in diversity. And what is interesting is this plummets before this administration came. Companies are backing off from their statements of social responsibility even before the administration came in, while there was an administration which was for much more social responsibility. And I suspect this is because after the pumping up during the pandemic, Black Lives Matter, this, that, they suddenly find the political reaction. The Republicans are saying we want to divest from funds that preach this. Look at Larry Fink's 2024 letter. Compare it with his 2017 letter. There's no mention of purpose in the 2024 letter. He has backed off completely. And that's why I think it's a fragile thing to place your hopes in corporations. This is diversity and inclusion. These are the elements of social responsibility. Let me focus on diversity and inclusion. This sort of picks up in the 60s because of the civil rights movement. It has some momentum, but then through the 70s, it comes down, picks up again, and then a huge increase, George Floyd. But even before that, it's increasing. All the black, the sad, tragic cases of males being, shot by the police, et cetera, creates a lot more awareness. And that pushes companies to say diversity and inclusion is important. But what I want you to pay attention to is the massive plummeting. Before this administration said, you're off base if you say diversity and inclusion. So if you can't stand up in a politically friendly administration, what are you going to do when the administration turns hostile? And so last point I want to make, then I want to open to questions, is this. I told you that what you're basically seeing on the stakeholder side is that companies are moving to say we're both about stakeholders and shareholders. And you can see it a little bit in this, but we need to strengthen the argument. We put every year companies into buckets. Are you above the median in terms of how much you emphasize corporate performance? Are you above the median in terms of how much you emphasize stakeholders? Or are you below the median on both? There are 4 buckets you can have with a 2x2 sort of split, right? It turns out that initially, most companies are in the high corporate performance, low stakeholder bucket. But there are some in the high corporate performance, high stakeholder bucket, and there are about 40% in the low stakeholder bucket with varying measures of corporate performance. Over time, what you see has expanded hugely is now close to 60% of the firms are in the high stakeholder, high corporate performance bucket, okay? And the number who are in the high corporate performance, low stakeholder bucket is pretty much close to zero. I want to say a lot of these companies converted to that. Of course, this chart won't tell you that. And we need to do more work to show you that. But I would argue that a lot of companies have moved into the high stakeholder, high shareholder bucket, okay? High corporate performance. And well, let me leave it at that and say that is consistent. That's no proof of what I'm saying, but that's consistent with the idea that now companies are trying to balance stakeholders and corporate performance. You would ask, well, what about on the social side? What do we see? On the social side, I leave it as saying the following. You see those cycles again in the data. It's not the steady change. You know, high corporate performance embraces more social side, embraces for a little while, comes down, and then goes up, then comes down again, and goes up again. That suggests embracing social projects, social objectives is much more ephemeral, is much more political. And that's why I say it doesn't have durability. I don't think you solve the problem of climate by getting companies to make voluntary commitments, only to see those voluntary commitments backed off when the government changes. I think you need reliable government policy. Of course, government policy can also change with changes in government, but that is more durable, has more effect on corporations. And to my mind, that's the way when you want to talk about big social change, you need the government to do it. And you can't, corporations can be regulated to do that. I'm not against that. But I'm saying going beyond the regulation to do it as an entirely voluntary effort is going to be something much less reliable. Okay, let me conclude there. I can keep going on. I haven't talked about AI. Everybody talks about AI. Happy to talk about AI. But basically, shareholder primacy makes less sense for large public corporations. They are stating a responsibility towards relevant contractual stakeholders other than shareholders. And I think that's a good thing. I do think the recent movement towards them accepting responsibility for the whole of society has gone too far, and they backed off from it even before the change of administration. And that's why I think it's too fragile to rely upon. You don't need to have to save the world. That there is an inspiring narrative that companies can create about their business, even without saying it's about saving the world. Making cheaper, better soap accessible to a lot of people across the world is a good deed. And let's emphasize that rather than saying, I want to be ashamed of some private venture and I need to find a larger purpose outside the basic corporate purpose. Okay? Let me stop there. Happy to take questions.
Thank you.
All right, we have time for questions. Some still with some students, but
Yeah, thank you so much for taking time to for that. How do you think that people like Milton Friedman would have reacted to the administration today? Because a lot of the people involved with Doge would claim to be part of that tradition, but then you get things like tariffs and if we're still like that.
I mean, look, government, whether run by left of center governments or right of center governments, in one way have become much more interventionist, in another way have become much less responsible. So where the intervention is in the face of massive technological change, which is causing, loss of of secure jobs, of good jobs, especially for the middle, especially for the moderately educated. Many of them feel they have to take it upon themselves to create those jobs either through subsidies, et cetera, or through increasingly protectionism, as we saw yesterday. Okay, so that's one aspect that I think Friedman would sort of disagree with. I think the other aspect which he would maybe agree with, but I think I would disagree with, is a total lack of action on important issues like climate that government is missing. Perhaps more present in Europe, but in many countries, there's a sense that technology will come to the rescue. That somehow, and it's pretty pervasive. I think it's potentially magical thinking. We somehow believe we will find the right technology at the right time, but you can also already see the consequences of climate change, especially in the poorest countries. So I do think that more policy intervention to move us in the right direction is important. But Friedman would probably say, I don't know what he would say on that issue.
Hi. Thank you for your presentation. My name is Mary and I'm one of the IBA students. I wanted to ask you about AI. I think something interesting that a lot of AI companies are doing is value alignment. So they're trying to just create ethical models and trying to decide what ethics to imbue with a model. And some of them are even holding these democratic consultations and focus groups with humans to try to decide what values a ChatGPT, for example, should have, which seems like a traditional activity of the government. So I wanted to ask what you think of these like ethical self-regulating activities. Do you think that this is a case of them substituting the functions of the government and there should be more separation? Or do you think these activities are appropriate given the nature of AI and its general purpose use?
Well, I think there's significant downside risk for a company if it has AI running, its own AI product running amok, right? I mean, there is variance of downside risk. In some authoritarian countries, if your AI returns an answer which says the dictator is a schmuck, that gets you into trouble. So you find also ways to prevent that answer from coming. But in more generally, I think the company has an incentive to see that AI doesn't produce answers which eventually creates reputational risk for it. And it may be anything that affects society. That said, does it have the same incentives as government? Sometimes it has better incentives, for example, than a dictatorial government which doesn't want any aspersions cast on its management. But sometimes it has worse incentives when the objective of AI is to get people to buy more of your product or something like that. So I would say there's a role for government oversight, but I wouldn't say that that's the only entity that can play that job, that private corporation. There is an alignment with their basic business, which is I'm selling an AI product. I have to make sure it is reasonable.
Okay, so given that the government play a huge role on achieving this objective, you think a certain degree of practice of state capitalism, which is prevalent in some developing countries, could positively contribute to this measure, or do you think it might be counterproductive?
I sort of worry about state capitalism because it's so close to cronyism. I worry that, it's actually an extreme where you pick the winners. And you don't just pick the winner companies, you pick the winning sectors. And I do wonder about why it's prized so much, given the problems we see with state capitalism emerging, certainly in China. You're seeing that all the effort China has put in to creating a production sector has also, resulted in huge problems for its consumption sector. Households being suppressed in order to transfer the profits to the production sector, but also that there's a lot of waste given the fact that profitability in Chinese companies has been falling tremendously, not only do they not have local domestic demand, but even the production is excessive. You've seen all these reports about Chinese production capacity in batteries and EVs being greater than world demand. So all this tells me state capitalism is not the answer. Maybe I'm overly conservative, but I think effective liberal markets is a good thing. But the key is to ensure a reasonable degree of competition. And that's what I fear with all this intervention. You kill the competition. So I'm not in the Chicago school which says, let the companies ride, let them get bigger and bigger. I do worry there's a political element the Chicago school doesn't pay enough attention to. But at the same time, I'm not for expanding the size of the government.
Yeah. I want you to ask a question about how should we think about the tax system in government if we want corporation to take more social responsibility. And I want to give a real example in China. In China, some land is not owned by the state, but owned by the cooperative. And in that area, like the government don't want to do anything for that community. They want like that cooperative firm to build their roads, to clean their stuff. But at the same time, the firm also pay a lot of tax to the government. And there's a real issue for them to think about what's the appropriate rights for them and what's their feature. Is it there as a firm or there as a, like some non-profit things, like, social?
Yeah, you're talking about the local government vehicles, I think. And that's a strange beast, right? Because what the federal government did was appropriate all the taxation and then said, you guys need to fix the local stuff, but you don't have strong revenue sources. So what you do is you borrow and then you sell land in order to, pay back. And that works so long as land prices are rising and you have, a strong market. It stops working when land prices start falling. And that's when you go back to the central government and say, bail me out. That's what we have. It's a strange beast. I think it worked for a little while. But I think the right approach would be to give local government enough sources of revenue so that they can do what is needed locally, build out infrastructure, etc. So I'm not sure that the answer is put the burden on some sort of quasi-private, quasi-public entity, because to some extent, what you want is the local recipients of the benefits to be able to essentially see that their tax dollars are going, tax renminbi, are going to fulfill benefits so that they, there's some close relationship. When that relationship breaks down, I think you don't have enough local bottom-up governance of local efforts. So I thought the decentralized system worked well in China, but I think the forcing the decentralized system to develop its own revenue sources is proving to be a disaster. And we're seeing the consequences of that now.
Yeah. So what evidence do we have, if any, that these statements are more than cheap talk? So are there any accountability mechanisms? Do they have metrics for delivering on the promises, the values, all that kind of thing? Of course, you can tell a story about this, that it's like, this is just signaling. Yeah. They're just responding to prevailing discourse, something like that. And insofar as it doesn't actually materially change the conduct of the corporation, this is all just epiphenomenon.
No, it's a great point, and it's a great question, and so we looked at performance, and the problem with any kind of causality is, when you're doing badly, you might adopt more corporate performance metrics to get yourself to do better, right? And so what drives what? Does bad performance drive more metrics, or does strong metrics drive good performance? And so the endogeneity problem is a huge one. But, we looked at, for example, statements about the environment. Do they correspond to how these firms perform on various sustainability indices? Let's at least get that straight. It turned out that, they do. But when you parse it in more detail, you find it's all the box-checking stuff. Mm-hmm. Nothing on actual performance. Now, my whole point is the social stuff seems to be more performative. And that's consistent with the ups and downs and, what is the mood of the moment? And let me respond to that. The question that you're asking is, what about the rest? Is that less performative? When I say I care about my employees, do I really mean it? And we need to check whether, in fact, these kinds of statements precede, for example, improvements on Glassdoor, how you're rated as a company. And case studies, Unilever starts talking about the environment, starts talking about the sustainability, and attracts a whole lot of young people who care about that. Their Glassdoor indicators go up through the roof. The only problem is they seem to also be attracting a whole lot of people who care only about that and not about making soap. And that becomes a problem down the line, that they have a constituency which is really strongly aligned with the social purpose of the corporation, but not necessarily with its business purpose. And that's when the tension starts and it goes off track. But it's a very good question, and it's one we're struggling with. Are these all performative statements? The only thing I can say right now is, the fact that they keep repeating it at least gives it a little more durability than the social statements that they make.
Yeah, my power of moderator to insert just a quick follow-up to Kevin's question, because I was also thinking, so what is it about shareholders and the composition of shareholders that makes these CEOs think that these types of narratives are going to play out well with shareholders? And so one question that comes to my mind is whether there, over time, have been changes in composition also on that front or not, whether there have been any generational changes on that front or not. So in other words, we know that from what you're telling us on the stakeholder side of things, it's more aligned, it makes more sense that employers have a stake in the company, then bosses want to have a good relationship with employers. With shareholders, what do we know? Are they the same type of group? Do they change?
Well, what I can tell you is the rise you see in the 80s and the 90s, till the middle of the 90s, is correlated with increase in institutional shareholding. It's also correlated somewhat with takeover threats within the industry. Industries that experience more takeover threats tend to have more firms saying, we care about shareholders. Again, cause and effect, we can debate, but we basically think outside pressure in these forms tended to increase shareholder sort of statements by companies. Again, we don't address Kevin's question, is this for real, or is this just playing to the gallery? What is interesting is in the 2000s, institutional shareholders became much more aligned on some of the, non-shareholder objectives. Many of them signed up to the UN's Principles of Responsible Investing. And as more of them signed up, you can see that, there's now a negative correlation between statements about shareholders and institutional ownership. Do we see more social? Do we see more stakeholder? We need to investigate that. But certainly shareholder stuff comes off as the institutions seem to change. And it's aligned with whether they sign the principles of responsible investing. So I think you're right that your shareholding does matter, and some of the response is to that. But I said the fluctuations are far more with the social than still with even the shareholders.
Can we have time for giving a couple more brief questions, if people have them, please?
So I just, to my understanding, a lot of this is hinged on the reality that there's still a distinction between corporation and government across all industries. But to my understanding in like current landscapes, there isn't always that complete separation where corporations are already fulfilling substitutionary roles. For example, healthcare, there's a lot of substitutionary roles that I would associate with government, or even in things like finance, where big giant banks are stepping in as economic stabilizers in times of crisis. So I just wonder, in areas where corporations are already fulfilling that substitutionary role and acting as government entities, how do you address the question of obligation for those firms?
Well, it's a huge problem, right? On the last question, for example, when corporations step up, one of the big concerns which led to the Federal Reserve being created was in 1907 during the Knickerbocker crisis. J.P. Morgan, the individual, went down the street buying banks to the left and buying banks to the right to rescue them. But he also made a killing. And the sense was that we would never again let the responsibility for rescuing the economy lie with a powerful individual, because that gave them too much power, right? And that's when the Federal Reserve, I'm sort of making it much sharper, the argument. But that was one of the big reasons why the Federal Reserve was created, as not so much monetary policy, but financial stability, to be a support when there was a financial crisis so that the JP Morgans of the world wouldn't get too much power. So we have been worrying about corporations entering the proper role of the government for a long time. And I would say it's better that you not be dependent on a couple of private entities for that, just because, forget everything, there is the issue of transparency and legitimacy. But there is also this real issue of power. And by becoming too reliant on that, you become too reliant on private power, which can translate eventually into political power. And eventually, pressed really hard, can become an impediment to democracy. So I'd say proper role for everyone. Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's.
Very last question, please.
Sure. Thank you so much for the presentation. My name is Jamin, and I'm also part of the IDE program. I wanted to ask about executive compensation, and especially the decline in the focus on salaries and direct compensation, and the increase in the focus on other types of compensation, dividends, stock, and so on. So do you feel that there is a way to design executive compensation in order to discipline or incentivize the executive to stay in the middle ground that you described? So not be on either side, but actually incentivize them to stay in that middle position.
It's a great question. The easiest thing to incentivize is pro-shareholder value behavior by giving them stock options, right? And this is where I had a slide which I took out because my presentation was getting too long, but I talked about, Jensen and Murphy in a famous 1990 paper talked about CEOs being compensated very little by stock. And that, gave the legitimacy for CEOs now to compensate themselves with, many, many millions, culminating with Elon Musk's 53 billion. And, in that, there's a lot of pay for non-performance. Sendil Mullainathan and Marianne Bertrand show in oil companies, when the oil price goes up, CEOs make more. The oil price is completely exogenous to their revenues, but they're making more as a result, right? So there's a lot of pay for non-performance. But put that aside, how do you pay for example, a better sort of climate within the firm? Now, there's a debate about that, whether it's something you achieve through pay or whether it's something better achieved through culture. If you make everything about pay, you introduce a certain amount of insincerity about it. You know, I'm being nice to you just because I'm getting paid for it, right? While if the culture becomes one, you know, we don't like jerks in this firm. We want you to be nice to each other, to strengthen the relationships, to make us a more productive family. That's a different kind of statement. You don't get paid to do it, but it sort of reflects in the broader ethos of the firm. So there are some people who say you can produce this behavior through pay, and others who say if you have to pay to produce this behavior, it's sort of fake behavior. And so this non-value aspects, the harder to measure stuff, I think you might have to generate through other means, you know, having a good HR department, having reasonable elements of this taken into account in promotions and so on, and basically sending the message that we like to treat our employees reasonably and fairly, and also building those narratives. How do you react in bad times? So I'm on the advisory board of an accounting firm where the CEO and his wife make it a practice to really spread the charm. And they also say, look, in bad times, we'll stick by you, like they did during COVID. Nobody was fired. They stuck by them and helped them weather the pandemic, even though, you know, it was quite easy for them to lay off people. That's the kind of narrative which says, which care about you and breeds the loyalty, which produces good performance.
Thanks so much. On that note, we're going to end our investor lectures. Thank you so much. Thank you.